Morning. Does this work? Yeah, good morning. We have a lot of seats over here, so I'm going to encourage you to continue to file in. I know it's a popular subject, and it's awesome to see so many parks advocates and lovers here this morning. So yeah, just feel free to keep moving in. There's still more seats over here. There's seats all around. There's some seats over here if people want. Good morning. Yeah, that was pretty good. Good morning. All right. My name is Gifford Miller, and I have the great privilege of serving as the chair of the Center for an Urban Future. And thank you all so much for joining us today. One of the things I love about the Center for an Urban Future is that it really excels at elevating important but often underappreciated issues onto the radar of public officials and the like. And that's always a key first step, because until people are thinking about it, people are talking about it, no one's going to do anything about it. And that's I think our job is to select issues that really need a focus and a boost, and then do our amazing work where we dig in and look at the facts and think about what are the solutions. And we've done it better than anyone, really, all over the place, whether it's spotlighting the vital role of branch libraries, documenting the need to better support the mostly low-income students attending CUNY, or making the case for a greater public investment in New York's parks. Our 2018 report, A New Leaf, provided a new level of detail about the infrastructure and maintenance challenges facing so many of our parks, and it played a huge role in sparking an unprecedented $43 million increase in city funding for parks maintenance, and created an enduring love for this organization from my mother, who will never forget it. Since that time, parks and open spaces have become even more vital to the health of New Yorkers and more critical to the city's economic future. And at the same time, maintenance needs have continued to grow. But for years, if not decades, New York has struggled to provide sufficient funding for the parks. To help solve this chronic shortfall, CUF published a new report last month that puts forward 20 creative ideas for generating revenues to pay for New York City's growing parks and open space needs. And I'm excited that today's forum is going to delve into those and other ideas for generating recurring funding for New York's parks and open spaces. I want to take a moment to thank our funders. We couldn't do it without the City Parks Foundation's New York City Green Fund and the Lily Auchincloss Foundation. Thank you both. They made this event possible and supported our report. And I'd also, of course, like to thank all of our amazing speakers, particularly Councilmember Shekhar Krishnan and Parks Commissioner Sue Donahue. It's now my, yes, okay, great. Yeah, always, very good. It's now my great honor to introduce our next speaker, New York City Deputy Mayor for Operations, Meera Joshi. Again, I love it. It's a positive audience. Deputy Mayor Joshi has been the driving force behind so many innovative public realm initiatives launched by the Adams administration, and we're thrilled to have her here today. Please join me in welcoming Deputy Mayor Joshi.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, height adjustment necessary. I love being at an event like this where I can wear my favorite color, olive green, and feel like I'm among friends. And I do also want to comment, I do love the old-fashioned music stand as a stage prop. I'm Meera Joshi. I have the honor of being the deputy mayor that oversees our city's infrastructure. In other administrations, parks was not considered part of the building blocks of the city. It was looked at as economic development. But under the Adams administration, that's changed. Parks is considered part of our foundation, our green infrastructure, and a necessity for New Yorkers to thrive. And so I'm pleased that we've made that change, and we look at infrastructure comprehensively, and it includes our green space. I want to give a huge thanks to CUF and all of the advocates that are here. You never give up. You are the catalyst, you are the people, you are the noise that keeps us on our toes. And every day I thank you for your work, not just in parks, but generally for the betterment of the city. It's an absolute yin and yang for government officials to have eager, loud, and incessant advocates. So thank you very much. I want to thank Commissioner Donahue, whose leadership has been creative, innovative, and real endurance during some very difficult times. We're talking about times where we're looking at parks as places to home people who have come to America. This is unheard of. But how do you make that work? How do you work with the Parks Alliances and explain these really unexplainable and unpredictable events in the midst of a humanitarian crisis? Sue's doing it, and I want to just really say thank you, because it has not only been difficult in terms of finances, it's been difficult in terms of how we have to allocate our resources in the city, given all of the new incoming immigrants that we have, who we welcome, but we didn't have immediate space for. So thank you very much, Sue, for all of your work on that front, and also to Councilmember Krishnan, who's been such a supporter, such a voice in council for the importance of parks, especially those in Queens. So thank you, Councilmember. So my portfolio is, as I said, it's everything underground, everything above ground, and it's those everyday services that every New Yorker uses. It's the water we drink, the water we flush, the sidewalks we walk on, the miles of asphalt that are really the platform for all the modes of transportation we have on our streets. It is essentially the green spaces, not just our legacy parks, but the little spots, the oases outside of our front door, those benches on a greenway. I just love seeing them on Ocean Parkway, the way people gather and really continue their lives outside of their apartments, which are a few blocks away. These are the places where creative community happens. These are the places where magic happens. And these are the places that allow New Yorkers to thrive and fulfill their ambition in our city. So thank you very much. I want to just say, I really think of parks as places where we have to think of three fundamental pillars. I hate that word pillars. It feels like consultants, but there, I just said it. It's that the parks need to work. That means the things inside them need to work so that people can actually go and take advantage of them. They have to support and reward civic behavior, and they have to inspire. And that means that we have to show a level of commitment, not just in building, but also in the maintenance of our parks, because they have to be welcoming so all those three things can happen. And I just want to highlight a few things that we've been doing, even in difficult times, to support the work that we have to do in our parks. We have to build quicker and better. A kid should not have to wait a lifetime to see a new playground emerge. So we're accelerating the planting of trees, construction of new skate parks, and we are advocating in Albany for the second year in a row for alternative delivery construction tools. We already can do design build. We're looking to get authority to do progressive design build and CM build, both tools that we will be able to use when appropriate that will allow us to move more efficiently, build better, faster, below budget, in less time. These are tools that small towns across America have, but New York City still doesn't. So it's high time we got that flexibility. We're also, and I was just in DC yesterday, chasing every dollar possible. That means that we will apply for lots and lots and lots of things, and we will not get all of them, but everything we don't apply for, we don't get a shot of getting. So it's a very different point of view than previous approach to grant applications in the city. And it's because of the times that we're in. One, our financial straits, and two, the opportunities in Washington. So we really have to take advantage of that. I'm proud that the Parks Department and Brooklyn Blooms was one of the Bronx Blooming. Apologize. Was one of the first recipients of an IRA grant award, $20 million to support our arborists and our urban forests, and most importantly, workforce training, which is a big element of all of our grant applications. We received, yes, a big round of applause for that. And thank you, Senator Gillibrand, for her support in that work. We received for the second time in a row a raised grant, and this time $7 million for our greenway planning, well underway. We'll be completing 5 greenways across the city, and that'll add 60 miles to new and existing greenways. So I want to thank DOT and Parks for their work that went into not only the application, but the plans that they've already got underway. And I was also, and I encourage everybody to do the same when I tell you, pushing in Washington for a capital construction grant of $118 million for the phase 2 of the Queensway. Manhattan should not be the only place that has a High Line. We need a High Line in Queens. We have an abandoned rail line, so I'll make a real unabashed pitch. Now is the time. These decisions are being made. So support Queensway grant application. Please get in touch with my office. We can tell you who needs to be written to and what the letter should say. And I'm sure there's plenty other people in this audience who could do the same. But I think this week this week and next week are times that we should really be pushing for these applications. And we focused on the reconnecting communities because although traditionally DOT looks as transit options or roads or bridges, we're demonstrating how parks are actually connecting communities. And that when there's an absence of one and there's neglect in the middle of 2 communities, it's actually a barrier. So I think it's a novel approach and one hopefully that gets some good reception in Washington. But we still need more money. We're clear on what our capital deficits are. We're clear on what we need to do in order to maintain our parks in the condition that every New Yorker deserves, especially those parks that don't have the benefit of an alliance where private money is coming in specifically for that park. And we all know exactly where those parks are. So I'm grateful for CUF and the creativity that's gone into what else can we do to fund our parks. I want to just talk a little bit about some of the things that are attractive to me in the report. I know we're going to have a few panels, and we'll go over a lot more in the detail of what's out there and what's available for the city to take advantage of. But some of the things that I really liked were increasing the fees for operating concessions in our parks. These are businesses that have an important role. There's somewhat of a captive audience, so for the economics, increasing fees kind of works. And it allows us to expand our resource base. I also believe that we should be exploring more places where we can put concessions. These are our prime locations. There's an automatic tourist and visitor attraction by virtue of green open space. And it's an opportunity for us to get some good capital funding for upgrades that need to happen within specific parks, as well as providing a little food, beverage, and entertainment for those that visit our parks. And things beyond the hot dog vendor are often welcome. So I think that there's really an appetite for that. A small fee on ticket prices. Even a nominal fee, we can see dollars come in if we use it for large venues and places like that. We're New York City. Our density actually is our secret weapon. Whenever we make a small change, it affects millions, and so millions come rolling in. So I absolutely think we should take advantage, to the extent we can, of that ability. On stormwater management and monetizing our banana peels, both of which I really support, we're working on citywide policies for both of these. On stormwater management, there is Albany legislation that is being discussed that would give the DEP the ability to assess fees. We won't call them fees, we'll call them something else. It's an election year. But assess additional charges where land users are not taking precautions that they could take to make their land more absorbent. So it's really about making sure that we do put the cost where it belongs when it comes to stormwater mitigation. And with our banana peels, we're thrilled with sanitation's work on organics. We've got curbside organics in Queens and Brooklyn, all 5 boroughs soon. And we're working to ensure that as we develop our organics muscle, we're also developing our co-digestion muscle. Newtown Creek, we have a pilot going on right now that organics is being digested. It turned into gas and injected into the grid. That's through National Grid. It helps power Newtown Creek. Ultimately, at scale, this can power homes. So it won't happen overnight, but it is certainly a citywide plan that is paired up very well with our citywide organics. And I'm hopeful about the ability, even if it's not revenue, it is in cost savings in terms of power. And both of these will have a direct benefit for parks. So I certainly support both of them. And finally, I love the merch idea. I think the best thing we saw on Government Isn't That Nerdy is the rate at which the NASA clothing took off, right? All of a sudden, one year, everybody was wearing NASA T-shirts. So who knows? Parks could be the next trend. I'm all for that. So I want to thank everyone again. The devil's in the details. There's lots to figure out, but it starts with the creativity. It starts with the will, and it starts with the acceptance that we can't do this alone. And I think that is the fundamental truth that has brought us all here together and will keep us working together. Thank you very much.
All right. I don't think anybody's ever raised the microphone for me before. Good morning, and can I get another round of applause for Deputy Mayor Joshi? A big thank you, not only for your leadership on a lot of these issues, for thinking about how to improve the speed of building things, for looking and really getting ahead of going to Washington and getting our fair share and as much as we can, which is obviously one of the ideas in our report. But really also thanks for taking a close look at the report and taking it seriously. I'm Jonathan Bowles. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for an Urban Future. It's so great to see so many people here and so much passion for this issue. I'm here to just spend a few minutes. I know everybody wants to get to our panels, and so do I. But we did just do this big report about 20 ideas to pay for parks, and I wanted to spend at least a few minutes walking through a few of those ideas. By the way, there's a bunch of folks standing. We do have a few seats over here, a few seats there, but it's great to see so many people here. I also want to, as we talk about this report, I want to thank so many folks in the room, advocates, people that run parks, people that are involved in their community parks who helped inform our research. We had a bunch of focus groups and roundtable discussions that really were so critical in kind of helping us come up with these ideas, many of which the ideas were yours. So thanks for that, and also a big thank you to John Sirico and Eli Dvorkin from the Center for an Urban Future team for writing and researching this report, so thanks. So the starting point of our report is that, of course, we need the mayor and the city council to increase funding for our parks by a good amount. But even with a healthy funding boost, which right now seems unclear at best, it's unlikely there will ever be enough dollars in the city budget to pay for the growing maintenance and infrastructure needs of our parks and invest in the new green spaces that are needed in several communities. That's why we think city leaders need to get creative and develop new sustainable revenue streams for our parks. So our report has 20 specific revenue-raising ideas. So we have kind of 5 major groupings of kind of what the ideas are, and I'm going to spend a few minutes on them. Our first idea is around creative, dedicated revenue streams for parks. For example, we propose a new 50-cent or $1 surcharge on tickets sold at stadiums located on parkland, like Citi Field and the USTA Tennis Center. At Citi Field alone, it would generate more than $2.5 million for parks, enough to hire more than 50 gardeners. We also propose a voluntary contribution from hotel guests, maybe a fund that would be created for parks and culture. We also suggest the creation of new fees on gas-powered leaf blowers and stormwater management, and new programs to monetize organic waste from parks, including turning fallen trees into commercial lumber, so that the city can convert the multi-million-dollar annual expense of tree disposal into a steady stream of revenue. We also call for a modest expansion of restaurants, cafes, and other concessions in parks, like year-round spas and existing pool houses. Things that could generate new funding for parks while enhancing the experience of park users. There are surprisingly few restaurants, cafes, ice cream shops, and other concessions in parks across the 5 boroughs. Where these concessions do exist, like Shake Shack in Madison Square Park, they invariably make the parks even more appealing. We suggest opening 10 more restaurants and 10 other new concessions in parks across the 5 boroughs by 2030. Meanwhile, for-profit events that are held in parks today, like soccer camps, music festivals, should be asked to pay more to parks' bottom line. We also suggest developing new opportunities for New Yorkers and New York-based companies to support parks. The Deputy Mayor talked about merch. That was one of the ideas. Right now, it's not so easy for individuals and New York-based companies to contribute to parks. We propose making it possible for New York City parks to fundraise through membership programs and special events, enabling thoughtful corporate sponsorship of parks assets, and expanded private support for fundraising initiatives focused on equity, like the New York City Green Fund, and launching a supercharged citywide street tree conservancy. Of course, we also kind of make a pitch for getting more of our fair share from Albany to fund parks and open spaces in the city. New York is home to more than 40% of the population statewide, but too often we fail to receive our fair share of state funding for parks and open spaces. We ought to change that. And then obviously, just as the Deputy Mayor was saying, we need to take full advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law. It's so great to see steps are being made in that regard, but there's so much more we could do. This is the largest federal investment in urban green spaces in decades, and so we all have to really pull out all the stops to make sure New York City gets a fair and large share of these dollars. And our final idea is really, I guess our 21st idea is not about generating new revenue per se, but establishing a mechanism to ensure that the new revenues that we do create benefit parks in every corner of the city, and not just those with new revenue generating concessions. We suggest establishing an 80-20 split for all future revenue from parks concessions, with 80% remaining in the park hosting the concession and 20% allocated to a fund to support parks with the greatest needs, particularly those in lower income communities. So we put these 20 ideas together. I went through them really fast. You can see on the back of the agenda that you all probably have the list of all of the ideas. Let us know, send me an email, reach out to our team after today, or let us know as you see us, what do you like? Are there other ideas that you have out there for what parks? I think that, while there's a lot of ideas that we like, it's great to hear that the Deputy Mayor likes a few of the ideas. I think the most important thing is that we just need some alternative revenue funding streams for parks. No matter what they are, we need to be kind of developing these other revenue mechanisms that provide more stable, sustainable funding streams for our parks. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up the first panel. I want to introduce and bring up our Senior Fellow for Climate and Opportunity, John Sirico. Excited to have him moderate, and if I can have just the whole first panel come up. Thank you.
Green room.
Hey, everyone.
No bottled water.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. As Jonathan mentioned, I'm John Sirico, the Senior Fellow for Climate and Opportunity at the Center for an Urban Future. I was the lead author of our 2018 report, A New Leaf, which really was the first look the center had done at the state of parks infrastructure in the city. And I was so fortunate to co-author this report that we're going to talk about today, alongside CUF's policy and editorial director, Eli Dvorkin, who you'll hear from a little later. So before we kind of jump into the panel, I'd love to just do some kind of brief introduction so everyone knows who's on the stage with me. Let's start from our right, Adam Ganzer, the Executive Director of New Yorkers for Parks. Hella Lubov, the Executive Director. Actually, let's start from the right here. Sorry. Julie Tai, President of the New York League of Conservation Voters. Morgan Monaco, President of the Prospect Park Alliance. Heather Lubov, the Executive Director of City Parks Foundation. And Chris, I'm going to get this right here, the Director of the Environmental Practice Group, Christopher Rizzo, at Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn, but also the advisor of the Van Cortlandt Park Alliance. So before we dive into the ideas that Jonathan kind of just laid out earlier, we should really just talk through first just what's at stake here. You know, our research has shown that the funding gaps for parks didn't just appear overnight, right? And I really just want to start here, and this is really for everyone else to kind of just chime in. You know, why are we here? Why do we need alternate revenue streams for parks? Anyone can kind of take that one.
I'll jump. Can you hear me? Is this working?
Yeah.
I think, from my perspective, I think the long, say, 40-year disinvestment or defunding of the park system is not really a revenue issue. It's a policy issue. And so I think looking at these alternative revenue streams gives the sector a leg up in that we are doing our work. We're doing what we can to help bring more funding to parks. But I think the onus is really still on the city to be making parks a priority. And we're talking about a maintenance and operation budget that is well within the city's ability to achieve. So I think the more pressure we can put on them with ideas like this, I think the more pressure we can put on them to live up to their end of the bargain.
Yeah, well said, Adam. And I'll add that, the Alliance was founded out of the fiscal crisis of the 70s. We know what happens when there's disinvestment in our park system. The places become places where people don't want to go. And because of, the private sector coming in to support, we have been able to transform the park to be the beautiful oasis that it is today. But it is very much a public-private partnership. We do depend on the city and the Parks Department to help with the day-to-day maintenance and upkeep of the park. And we provide programming and manage concessions and manage the capital portfolio, but it is very much a team effort. And we've seen, as Adam said, over decades what can happen when there is disinvestment, that these places that should be upheld as beautiful beacons of civic democracy and are so important and valuable to the way of life in New York City, deteriorate. And we just can't have that for the greatest city in the world.
I also think, I also think that unlike libraries, which are able to advocate for themselves, parks don't necessarily have spokespeople. So even though everyone assumes that the city is going to fund their park, without that noise behind it, when budgets get cut, nothing's going to change. So, I think parks have fallen behind because there hasn't been a strong, organized effort. Not to say New Yorkers for Parks has been doing anything wrong. They're actually fantastic. But I think more of us need to raise our voices because we just assume that the city's going to provide without really paying attention to what the budget actually shows.
I think it's also important to recognize that the parks in New York City that are freed from the tyranny of the New York City budget process actually look really good, and it gives us something to aspire to. There are parks run by conservancies like Central Park and Bryant Park, which look really good. There are parks that are run by state corporations like the parks in Battery Park City. They look really good. There are parks run by city corporations like Brooklyn Bridge Park, which look really good. There are parks run by business improvement districts. A lot of different models out there for how to supplement funding to parks, but what all these examples I've given have in common is they're not reliant on the New York City budget for maintenance and operations. And that's why this conversation and this report is really important.
Well, I think adding to that is we have to make sure that it's not only people who are well off and white who are benefiting from that, because all the parks that you just listed,
Yes.
the neighborhoods are predominantly well-off people who are white. And we need to make sure that that's much more diverse, and we can't just rely on that. So it's important to have, if there's new revenue streams, investments and prioritization of disadvantaged communities, who we know, I think as Mira sort of pointed out, like, we haven't treated parks as infrastructure. Parks are vital infrastructure. They're vital infrastructure for fighting climate change. We know this, like, parks provide that open space and respite that help us reduce temperatures in neighborhoods. That's really, and that's not just street trees, right? But that's a part of it that can help really reduce those temperatures, which are very often in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods that don't have enough money to pay for air conditioning. And we need to be making these investments. I also think politics plays a part in this, because we had a person who, for very, very long, was doing a lot of work to invest in parks in places that he found convenient, and wielded a lot of power. And I think there was a sort of blowback when Robert Moses stopped being in charge. So there was sort of a political swing, because we had a lot of money for parks for a long time, and he just, quote unquote, he did a bridge too far in hurt parks, I think, in a period of time after that. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to get back there, because everyone uses a park in New York City, right? And COVID showed us how important it is for everyone.
Chris, kind of going to your point, I think when I was so struck during the research just seeing that we have all these scattered models in New York City that are kind of present around the country, but they're so balkanized, right? And they only exist in certain neighborhoods. And what about the other 1,700 parks in New York City that don't have these models? And kind of, Morgan, to your point about the 1970s fiscal crisis, we've documented that parks headcount still has not recovered from the 70s, right? It actually has fallen 38% since the 1970s fiscal crisis. And last year, actually, the system's major maintenance needs topped $58.9 million, and only 60% of those needs were actually being met. So, Adam, kind of turning to you, but what you kind of started by saying, New Yorkers for Parks, has done such an impressive job, really showing to the public and policymakers really what the needs are facing parks right now. I'd love for you just to kind of paint a picture for the audience of kind of what parks are going through right now.
Well, first of all, we do our work in concert with so many organizations that are represented here. So it's I think one of the main things that's happened over the last 4 years is the expansion of that advocacy effort into conservancies that haven't been maybe as supportive as they could have been. Environmental groups like Julie's group. So it's really become a much louder voice through getting broader. You mentioned, or Jonathan mentioned, after your report came out in 2018, there was, the Playfair Coalition formed. There was a budget jump of $43 million. That was the first significant increase in the budget in many, many years. Within 2 years, the Parks Department had been cut by $85 million. And then we had a recurrence of another increase in budget. And so what you see is this sort of moving of the needle a tiny little bit back and forth. But unless you zoom out, you're not seeing how little money the Parks Department is getting from what it used to get. It used to get 1% or more, and how little money it's getting compared to other major agencies. And that really isn't changing. I think what we're seeing most recently is sort of a continuation of what I call defunding of the park system. The November budget, first of all, has a hiring freeze for the Parks Department, which will, they'll lose 600-700 employees, elimination of some key programs. But beyond that, the administration cut the Parks Opportunity Program. So all told, that was about a 12% cut to the Parks Department. And this from an administration which has said they want to get to 1% of the city budget for parks. And in fact, the Parks Department was the only agency during Mayor Adams' campaign that they said they would be investing in. So it's easy to say these things. I think we have traction around that. But when the budget cycle happens, we're falling into the exact same patterns where sort of equal cuts across the board, no recognition of the state of the different agencies. So this situation right now is the same situation we've been in virtually every other budget crisis. Mm-hmm. Parks Department is getting cut more than other agencies. And this is Sue can or cannot talk about this, but this is an agency that is strapped and has been strapped for 40 years. We're trying to change the narrative around that, and I think this report is part of that.
It's something that you all kind of touched upon in your opening remarks that I just want to kind of take a second to call out is just this kind of bold vision for parks and open spaces that really, part of the way we can get there is talking about this funding equation, this kind of the pendulum swing you talked about, going back and forth and really changing the funding equation for parks so they're treated as infrastructure. And also just to meet their, multiplying needs. It's, we haven't even talked about climate change and how much more parks are going to have to do in the next coming years. And we saw that, with Hurricane Ida. We've seen that with urban heat island effect, things like that. The ideas that Jonathan mentioned before we put forward really cover a range, as we've seen. So I kind of want to jump into them a little bit, some specific ideas. But before I do that, I'd love to hear from you all. What stand out? What ideas kind of hold the most promise?
I'll start because I'm not shy. I love the idea. Let me start back. I just finished looking at my Yankee tickets for the year, and I noticed that my prices changed a little bit, but they didn't really ask me, which is fine. I didn't notice it, and I think that's the point here. We can add a surcharge to ticket prices, and people are not going to notice it. You're paying, if you're lucky, $12 for a beer, right? You can pay $1 to support parks, and frankly, I think the sports teams and the venues would get a win. My colleague Alia, who's here, was like, "I paid $20 for a honeydeuce." How many people buy honeydeuces when you go to the U.S. Open, right? And it's amazing. I think there's a lot of opportunity there to get New Yorkers and visitors involved in that every single year, and at virtually no cost that you can hardly even recognize. I think that the state parks keeps their revenue. That doesn't cover all of their expenses, but it covers a lot more than Sue gets, which is nothing. Right, so I think that is something that needs to be looked at, even if there are legislative challenges in order to accomplish that. I think that asking volunteers, like I love the idea of when you're coming to New York City and you're staying in a hotel, if you want to make a contribution to a park, because people don't pay to go to parks here. People pay to go to state parks, not in New York City, but rest of the state. You come in, you pay a fee for a whole car full of people. Right? If we're asking people to pay $2, $5, whatever, it's a voluntary contribution. DEC does that at the state level. It raises some revenue. It can help to offset some of your costs. And I know, like, when I go skiing, they ask me, do I want to contribute $1 to clean water? You know what? I don't have to. I do. But if you don't ask people, you don't get that. So I'll let other people talk. There's a lot of other ideas, but those are some good ones, I thought.
I want to point out that Yankee Stadium is built on parkland.
Yes.
So a surcharge on a ticket would be appropriate and maybe poetic.
They rebuilt parks next to it.
What's that?
They rebuilt parks at the
Kind of.
baseball fields.
On top of parking garages too. But the ideas that resonate with me are the ones that capture real estate revenue or engage the real estate community. New York City is a real estate town. The big money is in real estate. This is a bit of a downturn now because of interest rates and commercial real estate, but New York will come back. It always has. And we need to figure out a way to harness that money for parks, and we have not. We haven't scratched the surface of the methods or mechanisms that are there to do it. There are ways to use zoning to create incentives to fund parks. There is tax increment financing, which New York has always been afraid to use, but could legally without any change to state law. There are transfers of development rights, where you take development rights from parks and allow developers to use them in exchange for a payment to parks. There are business improvement districts, or what we call park improvement districts, where commercial or residential buildings around a park could have a supplemental property tax imposed on them to fund the park near them. All of these things would leverage real estate investment and real estate dollars for the benefit of parks. And I've always thought it was curious that New York City never tried to use those more aggressively. So those ideas, I think that's 3 and 14 in your report that really interest me.
I'll jump in. I think I agree with the surcharge particularly on stadiums that are on parkland. Aside from the revenue that it generates, it also reminds people that they're on public parkland, and I think that's really important because, I've seen Flushing Meadows after a game. It's completely ripped up. It's people don't recognize that this is public land that they need to take care of. The thing that I'm most interested in is how we use concessions, both within the agency itself, but also conservancies and other private groups that could also operate those. But I do agree, and I think it would generate some really entrepreneurial ideas that could be very interesting. given that we manage the Green Fund, I do have to put in a plug for the 80-20 split because, I do think there are lots of communities that will not be able to generate the kind of revenue that will be meaningful. And I think that it is our responsibility to make sure that all parks are well funded equally.
I think, yeah, absolutely. What I appreciate about the report, and was just talking about this, is that there are ideas that are kind of low-hanging fruit, that are things that have been hanging around for a long time. The concessions discussion is absolutely one that can be picked up immediately. I think that there's a lot of work that can be done there to increase revenue. And I'm with Chris. I think the ones that are most attractive to me are the ones that are going to bring in the most money. And so when we're looking at New York City, it's a real estate town. Real estate benefits from our parks. Like many real estate developers know that and are interested in contributing to that in some way. Many don't. So I think there's puts the onus again on the city to make this a priority for, we need to be building more housing. We want people staying in the city. Our parks are a great way for us to be doing that. So how can we be pulling value from the real estate sector?
Yeah, I agree with what Chris and Adam said. And, there is precedent for this, leveraging city planning and zoning to achieve specific objectives. During the Bloomberg administration and the Million Trees campaign, we were successful with creating the street tree zoning amendment. So developers and private homeowners were required to pay into a tree fund if they had to remove a tree. So there is precedent for having our values lead our zoning amendments. But I'll also add, in terms of stormwater, I agree with the deputy mayor that one has promise. Maybe we don't call it a fee, we call it a charge. But Parkland makes up 14% of the city, so that's a significant portfolio or significant portion of land that does actually absorb stormwater. And of course, our street trees alone absorb over 1 million gallons of stormwater a year. That's right, Jennifer? Accurate? Okay, good. And so it just makes sense that Parkland should benefit from all of the work that they do to support and capture stormwater. And for us at Prospect Park, it's very personal. The September storm of last year, Ophelia, really damaged so much of our pathways and our lawns. And I'm grateful that we're actually able to have a conversation with the Department of Environmental Protection, DEP, to think about leveraging green infrastructure funding to actually address some of the stormwater mitigation projects that we have in mind. So it takes, thinking outside of just one lane, thinking about how parks contributes to the city's overall stormwater management goals.
Yeah. It was, I was thinking back to, Heather, you mentioned Flushing Meadows. Actually, on the cover of a New Leaf, our first report, is a picture I took of Flushing Meadows the day after just a normal average storm. And it's a puddle that's probably the size of a mini lake. Flushing Meadows floods so often, right? And really has that problem that it faces.
DEP is actually working on green infrastructure near there because of that.
The cloud burst. Yeah, absolutely. But one thing that came up so often is just the immense monetary value that, Maureen, you touched upon this, that parks offer the city, yet often they don't reap the reward. And, we have a lot of ideas that are focused on NYC parks and opportunities there. But we also have some ideas that would better harness the existing system, like this idea to monetize organic waste left over from the city parks operations. Our research found that Hurricane Ida alone cost NYC parks $1.5 million in shipping the trees that fell from that storm to a landfill often. Because we don't have the infrastructure really to reuse and recycle these trees. But it seems like with an upfront capital investment, there's actually a way to turn that waste into opportunity through recycle and reuse. And Morgan, I'd love to just hear this, and I know this was an idea that stood out to you at Prospect Park, just to elaborate on that idea and what it would mean for Prospect Park.
Yeah, I think it just makes logical sense that we would be thinking about having a kind of closed circuit or closed loop system where, the waste that we're generating can be reused and releveraged to enhance, our parkland. In Prospect Park alone, we have 30,000 trees, and with the potential for, being able to keep the mulch within the park system that, it adds nutrients to the soil, and it just reduces the waste. So it just makes a lot of practical and logical sense. And, we were fortunate, we incurred a lot of damage, as did the entire city after Superstorm Sandy, but our capital team was really innovative and created the Zucker Playground with wood that was, felled trees to create a really active and natural playground landscape. So I think we've got to be really thoughtful about how we can reduce waste and actually make sure that these resources are being reinvested back into parks.
Yeah. And it's something that, I wanted to kind of go back a bit to the sports ticket surcharge, because it's one that comes up a lot. It's also the one that the New York Times plugged in their headline when they covered the report, which we'd love to see. But just for context, these were facilities, Chris, as you mentioned, that are on parkland, Yankee Stadium, Citi Field, USTA, but the existing lease fees don't go to the park's bottom line, right? Even though you have events like the US Open, these kind of massive sports event. I wanted just to kind of get a little bit more at that idea, because it's something that gets captured a lot of people's attention, a lot of folks here, just, thinking through what that kind of would look like in your mind, and how do you see it kind of working?
So I'll start. Again, having just looked at my Yankee tickets for 2024, I'm hoping I might get to play into October this year. I would imagine that you would just have a surcharge that's lined out on the ticket fee, just like Ticketmaster charges you, whatever. They have a Ticketmaster charge fee or whatever. They have a sales tax on, and that they would collect it, and periodically, quarterly probably, like with the sales tax, you could submit that to the city for them to deposit. I would imagine you'd have to spread the money around. You wouldn't make it specific to a particular area. You wouldn't limit it to the Bronx or Queens. You have to make it, just broad general funding to support their efforts. But I don't see why you wouldn't charge $1 for every ticket. I mean, if you were concerned about folks who perhaps couldn't afford tickets, you could have a $1 threshold about which they charge them. But I mean, there aren't that many tickets at Yankee Stadium or Citi Fields. Charges a little bit less because they don't win as much. Sorry, can't help myself.
We didn't put that into the report.
Right, but like even the USTA, I mean, they are charging a lot of money. Like people are paying, I just had nosebleed seats last year. I'm paying like $120 a ticket by like week 2. What's another $1? So I think that if you line it out and actually encourage the sports teams to embrace it and own it and be like, we're contributing X number of dollars to parks, I think would be a win for them. A public relations, benefit to them as well. So that's why I think it should be something that's a winner. If we can get the Yankees and the Mets and the USTA and other venues like that to be embracing it as something that's positive, that they are bringing people into New York City, and that New York City people are able to contribute to supporting the parks that they're on.
I don't disagree with any of that. I think it's potentially a great source of revenue. But 3 things struck me about the fee ideas in your report, and there's a bunch of them. There's an event surcharge, a stormwater fee, a parks fee on the real property transfer tax, and there's a few other fee ideas. And the first issue is, would that require state legislative action, because it's a sales tax event essentially? And I'll let Julie answer the question about what's the political climate in Albany for new sales taxes. I'm not sure about it. The second issue is, of course, that the New York City Parks Department does not keep revenue that's generated on parkland. So the New York City Charter says that any revenue Parks collects has to go to the general fund. So potentially you'd need a change to the New York City Charter to allow parks to keep this money that it's being collected. And the third problem is something we learned from the 1993 Environmental Protection Fund, which is the New York State legislature created the Environmental Protection Fund in 1993, and it said it was going to fund it through a new real property transfer tax. So New York State generates $1 billion a year from this real property transfer tax, and it goes to the state, and then the New York State legislature has to decide to allocate that to the Environmental Protection Fund. And some years it doesn't allocate anything, some years it allocates $200 million out of that $1 billion. So that's a real problem. It's a bait and switch, essentially, for all of us. So if we create these new fees, we need to create a way to make sure that they go to parks and don't get stuck in the general city budget and never come back to parks.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that because this was something that always just struck me so much when I researched parks, especially when you talk to parks around the country, right? So we spoke with parks groups all over the country. Is that New York City is one of the few systems where parks do not hold on to the revenue they generate. And as Julie mentioned, even state parks do this. You know, in New York, the model we have here is that the money goes back to the general fund and then it gets allocated to the budget. But this is an idea that really kind of resonated. I think Morgan and Heather, we talked about this idea a lot, just the idea of parks holding on to more of their revenue because it's where the actions, where the activity's happening. And I'd love for you just to both kind of elaborate or break down why you think that's important.
I mean, it's not unheard of. We operate summer stage, and you know the concessions revenue that we generate through food and beverage pays for 20 free concerts in neighborhood parks across the city. So it's not impossible. And you know, I think there are, you know, when I travel, parks have cafes all over, you know, all over the world. They keep spaces active and safe and energized. And you know, I think you're creating opportunities for local businesses to be entrepreneurial and to try things out. I think right now, since there is no incentive to keep for the money to come into, you know, for parks to keep the money, there's no creativity, you know, and that's not to criticize the concessions team because they're fantastic, and I see Alex sitting right there. But you know, I think if you incentivize it by, you know, saying you can keep 80% of this money or whatever, you know, whatever the right percentage is, I think you're going to see some really, really creative ideas, and I think New Yorkers would benefit, just like, you know, the food, you know, the food court in the Rockaways. Mm-hmm. It's a destination now. It's become a thing, and lots of places can say that, and I think we have such beautiful parks all over the city and so many opportunities.
Yeah, just, you know, to echo everything that Heather said, you know, other agencies do have dedicated revenue streams and they have, you know, the budget to maintain repairs. So it just makes logical sense that parks shouldn't be at this disadvantage. Absolutely appreciate, you know, some of the rationale behind why the revenue goes to the general fund is to disincentivize sort of privatization. But I think there's absolutely ways to put in guardrails to prevent against that. We are very fortunate. We're a living example of how our operating agreement and license with the city allows us to keep our revenue from our concessions, and everything goes directly back into the park. So there is precedent, there is a widespread example of how this can be successful, and it would be great to be able to replicate this citywide.
And I'll just note it's quite common in cities around the world, right? If you go to Paris and London, cities in the U.S., to have a drink or go to a restaurant in a park, right? It's a common experience. I think I stumbled upon one of those free summer stage shows in Flushing Meadows this last summer after the Queen's Night Market, and it was one of those like perfect New York City nights. It was great. It was cool in the gang. It was an amazing night.
That was fun.
So good. Chris, I want to go back to kind of your point about working with the city, because it's something that came up. You know, we held roundtables with parks groups, big and small. You know, the leading conservancies, the neighborhood friends of groups, because we wanted to hear from everyone for this. And what we really heard was this kind of the perceived challenges that folks face just working with the city or trying to help a park. So often they want to help the city out with supplementary maintenance or stewardship, but some sort of institutional barrier kind of comes up. You know, we heard from one source that there's little to no standardization between contracts. Some parks are allowed to adopt multiple benches for, you know, adopt a bench for 5 years. Some can only do adopt a bench 1 year. And Chris, I know we've chatted about this given your experience at Van Cortlandt Park. And with clients of your own, I'd love to just kind of hear firsthand. You know, one of our ideas or proposals is really to make it easier for private entities to work with the city to help care for the parks. Just to kind of explain to us what you've kind of seen firsthand, and also really what's not working.
So this is a sensitive answer because there are many important New York City Parks Department officials here. So I'm going to be delicate, or not. So just to be clear, what we're talking about is license agreements, essentially. And there is nothing legally problematic about the New York City Parks Department issuing a license agreement to a private, nonprofit park conservancy or Friends of group or alliance. Courts have addressed these sorts of agreements before, and they found them to be perfectly legal. So we're not talking about a legal problem with allowing the the Friends of Van Cortlandt Park or the Van Cortlandt Park Alliance or the Prospect Park Alliance to take over operation of a park or to keep the concession revenue and use it to maintain the park. But I think there has been a sort of a bureaucracy at the city that has made negotiating these agreements very slow. And there are so many different sorts of circumstances. I think it's hard to create a one-size-fits-all contract. I think that's never going to happen. But sometimes parks has very high expectations for these groups. They expect them to take over all of the operations or maintenance of a given park when they're really just ready to take on bits and pieces. Sometimes the insurance requirements or indemnification requirements are too onerous for a group that's just starting. There's a lot of concern and resistance to allowing these groups to keep revenue generated in the park out of a fear that there'd be an accusation of privatization, which doesn't really worry me at all. So I think it's not legal, it's political, and there's an internal inertia towards moving these along quickly and allowing flexibility. We have to keep in mind that these license agreements are always terminable at will, meaning the New York City Parks Commissioner or the mayor can always terminate them at any time if they're not working out. So the risks, I think, are pretty low from allowing more of these agreements to come into effect. But the benefits for parks could be really huge by allowing these groups to start bringing in alternative revenue streams into the parks to supplement the maintenance of them.
I have a couple of thoughts there. I think under the Bloomberg administration, these types of agreements were really pushed forward quickly. There was a real value to the public-private partnership, and then I think with the last administration, you saw a real pushback on that, and things really slowed down. The current administration, the mantra of the city of yes, has started to shift that, and I'm speaking very specifically about the commissioner's role in improving this, having come from that background, the background that many on this stage share, valuing the importance of these relationships. And one of the things that's come up, and not to harp on the budget cuts, but budget cuts go on every single line in the agency. So you're talking about an agency that is not short only on people who are cleaning bathrooms, but it's people who can review legal contracts. And so there's a real need to sort of invest in that bureaucracy, the positive sense of bureaucracy, to get to that city of yes, so that these really important agreements where you're getting, and I consider all of these organizations alternative sources of revenue already. That's the first version of it. But prioritizing that to streamline it seems like a real priority.
And so often groups that want to help their park, right?
Yeah.
Have this deep love for their park and want to do
No,
it.
you have, at all levels, you have people who are absolutely dedicated and willing.
Yeah.
And the commissioner talks about it all the time. What other agency or sector do you see thousands and thousands of volunteers out wanting to help? You don't see people filling in potholes because they love their street. This is
They gave
something
me the
people
shovel.
want to do. How do we make it easy? Understanding that's a huge management challenge for a strapped agency.
Yeah.
But I also think, and this is not, I can't take any credit for this. 30 years ago, the agency saw the need for those partners and created partnerships for parks as a way to support those groups and make it easier to do business with the city. But bureaucracy still gets in the way.
Yeah. I'm a very proud super steward of tree cleanup, so I respect it. Love the tree work. Thanks for the clapping of trees. Love that. This would be the room that would clap for trees. So,
Yes.
I wanted just to mention one last point before we go on to implementation, Chris, as you kind of touched on. And this is, Julie, for kind of things that we've discussed. We discussed a lot of ideas, though, today about maintenance needs, which is so crucial. But the system has a lot of capital needs. I think just this last year, $685 million in state of good repair needs, of which only 30% are actually underway or met. The system has huge capital needs, and that's not even touching so many things that we've documented and, that could be needed in the future. But there's a real role here for Albany. And I think Julie kind of, as someone who goes up to Albany often, just thinking through how New York City could really leverage programs at the state level and the opportunities there, what do you really see as the best opportunities for New York City getting its fair share in Albany?
So I think, Deputy Mayor Joshi really put it out there that, in the past, the city, and not parks necessarily limited to that, but across the board was not necessarily interested in applying for grants from the state because frankly, the dollar amounts are not that big, right? The Environmental Protection Fund is $400 million for the entire state for like four different buckets of programs, and then within them, many different categories. So there are limits, and so I think the city has not always applied for those grants. I think that's changed. I think there's been a more emphasis on, recognizing how can we go get that money, and the state with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is now really pushing for investing at least 35% of funds for climate efforts in disadvantaged communities. So that provides New York City, which has a great many disadvantaged communities, and real opportunity to help get those funds. So certainly the Environmental Protection Funds, which has a variety of different sources of funding. There's green infrastructure funding that comes from a few different pots. That is a real opportunity, and I know Parks has pursued some of that funding in a way that frankly DEP has not, because their projects are 8, 9-digit numbers versus, you can have a much smaller, you can get a $2 million grant a lot easier than you can get a $200 million grant. The Bond Act that just got passed in 2022, the Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Environmental Bond Act, that also includes a requirement for at least 35% of funds to be invested in disadvantaged communities. And there is a specific pot of money that's available for open space and parks, but this is all for capital infrastructure. Jonathan touched on it earlier. We have this amazing investment. It's finally Infrastructure Week, everyone. With the bipartisan infrastructure law and the climate, the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, there are opportunities and pots in there that recognize the value of open space and parks for fighting climate change and for the infrastructure that they are. And I love that the city is being creative and looking at how can they get other dollars that are non-traditional parks dollars, like the RAISE grants, to try and connect those greenways, and how can we help elevate that. So those are all pots of money that people should be pursuing all across the board, and advocating for. And sometimes it is, earmarks. Earmarks are back, everyone. People thought they were bad, but they're not the worst thing. Like an earmark could be, $119 million for the Queensway, for example. And that's something that people can rally around, and we can go to Congress for with specific dollar amounts, because it is harder to get, a $1 billion project funded from a $400 million, a year program. And we are trying to raise the Environmental Protection Fund to $500 million a year over the next few years. The state is also in not the greatest of shapes financially, so I don't think we're not going to get there this year. But certainly maintaining that is really important, and continuing to ask for the dollars, I think, is the number one priority, because as Deputy Mayor Joshi said, if you're not in it, you can't win it.
It's good to mention. Go ahead, Mark.
I just wanted to add, in addition to pursuing the capital dollars, I think the dream too is that there's the requisite expense money that is allocated simultaneously, and that there's ideally this ratio that, for when you have a big capital investment, that there is maintenance money that's allocated in kind, so that we don't have the situation where we have a disadvantage of these capital investments not living through their useful life cycle because there isn't adequate maintenance dollars to maintain them. So I would just add that as part of the dream scenario.
I would just caution that I don't think that the state would be willing to do that. Based on my experience, the state will invest a lot more in capital infrastructure, but they're not, even through the Environmental Protection Fund, there are very small organizations that get operating funds, but by and large, it is a capital fund, and they use capital dollars, and it's bonded. So there's restrictions on that. So I think, while it's ideal, I think the state mostly provides money to local governments through aid to municipalities, right? That's how they get their funding. And so I think I would just caution that I don't know that that's likely to happen in the near future for an adjustment.
Good thing we have 19 other ideas to help increase the city's revenue.
Just to build on that, it's the city that is applying for these funds.
Right.
And my opinion is that the city has the money to pay for operations of parks. It just does. All right. And so if we're being ambitious and trying to get state and federal funds to build new parks, and the city is going through that process, it itself should be putting in the money to make sure that they're successfully maintained. And that can be part of the conversation for sure, because I think otherwise building a bunch of parks that are going to
Yes.
fall apart.
100%.
I think it's important to, and Julie touched upon this, but it's worth emphasizing again. Some of the ideas in the report would provide capital dollars, like harnessing new market tax credits. New York State and New York City have done a pretty good job finding capital dollars to build parks. Maybe not ideal, but we've done a pretty good job. There's bond acts, et cetera. We probably should be focusing more on maintenance and operations, which can't be funded through bonds
Right, yeah.
and other capital grants. Those ideas interest me the most.
I agree. That is definitely those are harder dollars to come by for the state and
Right.
the local governments alike. And that is where the most need is, because you're right. Same thing, street trees, all the parks that we're talking about, we need to make sure that they're safe, clean, and accessible. And we can only do that with people.
Yes.
I'm glad that folks are already starting to think of implementation. How do we actually turn these from ideas into reality, right? So they don't just stay on the shelf. Some of these ideas can be done through legislation from City Council. Others are more internal to NYC Parks and City Hall. And some, even though we don't love to hear it, may even take Albany's approval. Words we never love to hear. But Chris, really given your legal expertise, I would love for you just to kind of walk us through key next steps that you see for some of these ideas implementation.
You've divided your ideas up into 5 different categories. I would probably divide them up differently, which is things that require state legislative action, things that require state and city legislative action, things that require only city legislative action, things that don't require any legislative action and can produce a lot of revenue, and things that don't require any state or city legislative action that probably don't have a lot of revenue potential. So for example, today people have talked a lot about concessions. I doubt under the current legal system we have for concessions, they can generate a lot of revenue for parks. Sure, Shake Shack in Madison Square Park can produce a lot of revenue. It is such a prime location today. But for most parks and most locations, that's not going to happen. In the report, you guys cited the Jacob Riis Pavilion and how much money the private developer or of that facility is going to bring into the park. And that's true, but that's because the National Park Service was able to lease that pavilion for 60 years to that private partner who's going to undertake a massive capital renovation and maintain it and maintain the parks around it. And New York City Parks Department doesn't have the ability to do that. So in terms of implementation, what I like to think about is what has to change in city or state law to make these things happen. To use concessions as an example, you probably need 2 big things. At the state level, you probably have to give New York City the ability to lease concessions, not just license them. Because no developer is going to come in and undertake a massive capital renovation and invest a ton of money in a restaurant in a park if all they have is a license, unless it's a really special location. And that requires a change to state law. And then, of course, what we've talked about, which is the change to the New York City Charter, which would allow the Parks Department to keep that concession revenue and funnel it right back into that park. So that's just an example of the sorts of things that have to happen that are a little bit sobering about some of the ideas in the report. There are other ideas that don't require any legislative changes. For example, creating a park improvement district. State law allows that, city law allows that. It's about the political will to create those park improvement districts to tax the buildings around the park and direct that money back to the park.
Yeah. We made such an effort when we were putting this together to look at examples of other cities, right? Because we get into that New York City kind of habit of being like, hard to do it here. It's a hard city. But the sports ticket surcharge came from Columbus, Ohio. The stormwater fee came from Philadelphia. These are models that exist in other cities, and New York City, of course, should be the city that should be able to do. But of course, there's the legal challenges to kind of think through. Adam, kind of turning to you, with New York is for Parks, your organization has helped build such a formidable advocacy campaign and coalition with Playfair. And it really has shown a spotlight on really the funding inequities in our park system and also the lack of maintenance dollars. So I'd love to just kind of think through, how do we mobilize New Yorkers around this idea of funding parks, finding alternative streams of revenue, and really getting to that place?
Well, I think right now, there really is an appetite for change. and as this is, Julie mentioned it before, coming out of COVID, the importance of parks and open spaces and the conditions of parks and open spaces became top of mind to everybody who was going to them. And what we've seen is in the city council, there's immense appetite for investment in parks. We've gone to nearly every community board. There's immense appetite for investment in parks. I think there's, and of course, we've referred to this before, the mayor has committed to getting to 1% of the city budget for parks. So the narrative is out there. I think that the political will is out there as well. And I think this campaign, which we've been running, which is, again, it's a campaign that needs the help of electeds, but is really focused on people and organizations that are using parks and relying on parks, bringing that same message to those people so that it becomes more of a rallying call rather than, a little bit, no criticism, but an academic report that comes and goes. And again, I think that there's a huge willingness in this sector to unearth every idea that could potentially bring more resources to the city's Parks Department. At the same time, this isn't going to solve the issue, right? It's augmenting what should be sort of a baseline investment from the city and a recognition that we need to get someplace. And I think the idea of two separate revenue streams, or being able to track what parks and park stewards are bringing in, which incentivizes them, but also shows what the city needs to bring in to get to that goal, those things make a lot of sense. But I feel like this directly dovetails with the campaign that we've been running.
So I think Heather kind of put it out there properly, in that New Yorkers expect that the city is going to take care of their parks, period, right? And I think it's incumbent upon all of us as advocates and the Play Fair campaign to remind New Yorkers that in order for us to save their parks, we need their voices, right? They need to stand up. They need to sign a petition. We have a petition asking for the city to invest 1% in parks. We want to make sure that they are safe, clean, and accessible. But in order for us to have that, so that we can get Sue the revenue she needs, the money she needs to keep those parks in all parts of our city viable and something that we can all be proud of, and not just in places that we have rich people around them. We need to make sure that all New Yorkers are lifting up their voices, right? This is easy. This is not a hard, complicated thing that we're asking New Yorkers to do. Like, saying yes, we want our parks to be saved is something that every New Yorker can do by signing our petition, by helping to participate in rallies when we have them. It's really about organizing New Yorkers to remind them they all use their parks and they want to make sure that they're invested in so that they're safe when they go there with their kids and their families, or to play baseball, or to play soccer, or to have a picnic. And we can only do that if parks are adequately funded.
So before we take questions from the audience, and I'm really excited what folks have to kind of ask for this panel in particular, just very briefly for everyone, just what's one next step for policymakers that you'd like to see, for policymakers to take towards realizing these ideas? Very briefly.
Well, again, I mean, today's forum is incredibly important and a very important first step. We've got a dream team of folks from the agency and advocates and partners who are here, and it's really significant. We had the deputy mayor here. The administration is very much taking this report seriously and thoughtfully considering the recommendations, and I think that's what it takes. It's looking through and testing them all and figuring out which ones make sense to pursue in the near term and which ones are more appropriate for further study and long-term consideration. But as my colleague said, it takes forums like this, and the libraries were very successful in their campaign because people came out and had libraries' backs. We have a wonderful network of supporters in parks who have our back, and we just need to continue to sound the alarm and the drumbeat of why this is so important.
I have two things, actually. One is realistic, maybe, and the other is totally pie in the sky. I think the realistic one is you can apply for a grant from the New York City Green Fund. We just released our guidelines yesterday for systems change. That's exactly what it's meant to do. So if you hear something in this, if you read something in this report and you think, I know I can do this, but I need money for a lawyer, or I need money to research how other places do this, whatever that may be, apply for the grant, because that's why it's there. And this report came out of that. That's exactly what the funders of the Green Fund intended. So I hope that people will do that. My pie in the sky hope is that the mayor will actually tell Corporation Counsel to change their philosophy around how they think of risk and working with nonprofit partners.
I have two ideas. One is to dovetail off of Heather's comment. It would be great if the city were to take a more aggressive approach or to negotiating, I shouldn't say aggressive, a more open approach to negotiating license agreements with nonprofit partners and allow these groups to start taking responsibility in parks, even if it's just limited and in small ways. I think the risk is low and the benefits are really potentially huge, and that can happen right away. I think long-term, we need to start thinking about how to leverage real estate dollars for parks. That's going to take a few years to think about and put into place, and this is a perfect time because there's a bit of a real estate downturn in New York. What a great time to put the mechanisms in place to start capturing those real estate dollars for parks when the real estate market is booming again.
I'd like to see the mayor work with the advocates to advance the legislation to get us to having a surcharge on those tickets in ballparks that are on parkland. I think that's something that we can do and people would embrace pretty openly.
Again, I think as far as next steps, Julie and I, a month ago, met with the deputy mayor, and they were very excited. The report hadn't come out yet, but very excited about it. I think it really boils down to getting somebody in the administration to really take these ideas on and push them with advocates' support and being, selling them to the administration as viable ways for us to be doing what we should be doing anyway, which is maximizing the revenue the city can produce.
And I will say Albany is not such a scary place. I'm a creature of Albany. I know that it comes more easily to me, but it's not such a scary place, and we can get things done with them.
I'm happy the real estate point came up. I tried to cover all 20 ideas. The conversation was just so good. It will be covered in the panel that follows this. But thank you, everyone. I think we have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience. There's a microphone that's going to be going around. If you could very briefly just say your name, your affiliation, and keep your questions quite brief. Sure. Right here. Yeah.
Hi. A quick note on a fundraising and advocacy strategy groups may want to consider. During the FDR New Deal, parks across the city, big and small, benefited from a huge infusion of federal funds, facilities that are still in use to this day. I volunteer with the Living New Deal organization, a national nonprofit. We're leveraging those 90th anniversaries through this decade to call attention to that and to reinforce the value of public investment in these kinds of facilities. And those milestones can be a great opportunity for fundraising or burnishing a grant application.
Thank you.
Right here in the front.
Hi, I'm Claire Mifflin from the Center for Zero Waste Design. I just wrote an opinion piece in Bloomberg City Lab about how composting and how we should expand community composting, not defund it entirely, to support maintenance of green infrastructure. Because these groups like Big Reuse, they take parks waste, they compost it on parks land, they give it back in Queens to parks. And there's all these community groups and community gardens around the city that could be helping maintain the green infrastructure, meaning parks, street trees, and rain gardens. And I just wonder how that ties into your views. I mean, I think of Prospect Park, you get a ton of food scraps dropped off at Grand Army Plaza each week, or used to. And then, it could be tied with all the landscape waste in the park, and it could be composted in the park and used in the park for green infrastructure. Because if you add food scraps, it takes much less area and goes a lot faster. So I'm just wondering what people think of that idea and how it could be expanded citywide.
Thanks, Claire.
Yeah, so thank you. I agree with you, and that's what I was sort of talking about with this kind of closed loop system. And I've experienced with that in my former role at the Red Hook Initiative. We had a farm, so we were able to actually collect local food scraps that went directly into farming the beautiful fruits and vegetables that supported the local food system for the community. So in terms of Prospect Park, there's great potential. Our landscape management team is already very thoughtful about how how much we can reinvest back into the park. But I think I think there's an opportunity to think about how we could work with our partners. Grow NYC is the partner that collects food scraps with the farmers market. But I think there's a potential conversation to be had about how we could scale that up and leverage the 585 acres that we have in support of that sustainability goal.
Who else? Right here in the front, next to Jonathan. We have a microphone. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you have a microphone coming there. Sorry.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Maggie Greenfield. I'm a consultant currently working with the RAIN Coalition, which is made up of Bronx River, Gowanus Canal, Newtown Creek, Guardians of Flushing Bay. So it's 4 watershed groups with 2 workforce development groups, Green City Force and the HOPE program. But anyway, my question's not necessarily related to RAIN Coalition work so much as just the issue of equity. And I appreciated Chris's comment about like, oh, I would organize these recommendations differently, but actually a different way to organize them is in terms of equity. And which are the solutions that are going to provide revenue streams for parks in low-income parts of the city? Because some of these solutions provide more of that, and some of them provide more targeted funding for specific parks. So my specific question is around the concessions and the 80-20 split that's proposed, and like where did that number come from? Is that possible to be renegotiated in greater favor of equity?
That's a question for me as the co-author of the report. You know, this was something that we kind of were just thinking through how you know, the park, that actually this kind of point that the park itself needs to hold on to its revenue. You know, this is kind of being the core of a problem. But we weren't particularly tied to the 80-20. It was something that's just to get people thinking about this, that this could be a funding split, and also making sure that there's money that goes to parks where you can have don't have the underlying economy to support concessions, to support a Shake Shack, for example. But we're open to it. That's what we're here to talk about, kind of thinking through that and what that would look like.
I would say that the Justice 40 has been a pretty broadly adopted model. You know, again, the state is almost there. It's like 35% with a goal of 40%.
Yeah.
And certainly the president has been pushing a 40% initiative, so we would support that.
Yeah. Yeah, next to this column right here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Ratner. I'm the board chair of Friends of the East River Esplanade in Manhattan. So we go from the new and phenomenal East Midtown Greenway all the way up to East Harlem as the conservancy for the waterfront. So I had a couple of questions. One, beyond the licensing agreement, making those easier with parks, because we have a lot of experience on a small level with that, and it's really, and the indemnification, the insurance requirements are extremely onerous for smaller parks conservancies. The question I also had is, how can we make it easier to work with the Parks Department to help us market our organizations? Because that is extremely difficult when we are not allowed to put signage on the waterfront or in the park on the waterfront to say that we are here. Because I will say that, you know, at our events, at lots of other things, one of the main things that people say is, we want to help you. We didn't even know you exist, because we're small nonprofits that are running a business without any revenue whatsoever. So that's one question. And then for people within the government to start thinking, how can we make it easier for them to think more proactively? So on the waterfront, we are now having miles of new waterfront parks constructed without any potable water. So there's no possibility of even putting concessions on the new waterfront that's going to happen in East Harlem. An over $300 million project that will not have any possibility of having any kind of permanent concession. So how do we get the word out for those things? So those are two things I want to say. And then we do ourselves, we work with a gardening group that does composting right on site of food scraps, and we put it straight back into our garden. So we do have a model for that on our waterfront. So the first two were really questions, I think, mostly for our Van Cortlandt representative.
There's certainly, the prior administration was very strict about signage, and that was a policy decision. It wasn't a legal decision. the prior administration, the prior Parks Commissioner was very, very focused on uniform signage in parks and having a very conservative approach to that. But that was a policy decision, that wasn't a legal decision. There's no reason that the Friends of East River Esplanade could not put out more signage to promote your mission and attract members and donors, et cetera. That's really a policy problem that has to be fixed.
I think we have time. Go ahead, Adam.
I'll just add, you know, I spent 10 years working at the High Line, and we all know what the High Line is. We all know what Friends of the High Line is, but for the vast majority of people who are going on the High Line, they had no idea what the Friends of the High Line was because of exactly that. And it was very frustrating to be able to communicate how much that organization was raising for the operations and maintenance. It was just lost on people. So I think it's frustrating for a lot of the different groups.
We have time for one more question, one or two more questions. I'm going to do a pivot to my left here. Right there. Yeah.
Joydeep Roy from the New York City Independent Budget Office. We are a non-mural agency of the city. We work a lot on the financial, but also the other aspects. And my colleague Jordan here had just written a wonderful report on stormwater fees, so I really ask everybody to read it. I had two questions. One was mostly about the waterfront parks, but you took care of it. But the other one was, you started out by saying that there are lots of models for New York City parks, like different parks are administered and operated by different agencies. And what have we learned from all these different business models as to like how they are successful, how do we measure it, like how many people visit it, how many things they generate. And also, I don't know if we have time, but something about the value capture. I think like if we improve a park, how do we get some sort of like money from the properties surrounding that park? And also the last one is about like, where do we get all the data about like how many people are in the park, how many people attend all these summer programs. I don't see a lot of winter programs. I don't know whether that's like because we have like evenings at 5 o'clock, but anything with respect to that would be really important for my office. Thank you.
So the success of the different models that we've seen, conservancies, alliances, all sorts of different models we've seen in the city. What lessons learned?
Well, I think the conservancy model has been exceptionally successful. You see a tier of conservancies that are full-blown institutions at this point. And I think, with different administrations, there's been a prioritization of those partnerships because of the allure of that success. There's only a few neighborhoods in the city that can support that type of success, but it turns out there's multiple different organizations, I'd say 30 to 40, that are doing similar partnership work that are making real improvements to their parks, and they're raising not vast sums of money to do it, but through small staffs and volunteers. So I think that across the board, the model is seen as a success. I think there's another somewhat cynical view, which is that the success of that model has allowed the city to ignore the rest of the city's parks. And that's my cynical view. I'm an optimist, but I think, so that's not an anti-conservancy thing. It really, again, I'm not beating a drum here, it puts the onus back on the city. We need to tell the city that these models are fantastic, they're working really well, but your responsibility is to make sure that the rest of the city's parks are getting the same type of attractions.
Thank you so much, everyone, Adam. And on that note, I actually want to say, can we join me in a round of applause for our amazing panelists? Unfortunately, it's all the time. But to all of you in the room, don't go anywhere. We're going to move directly into our second panel right now. And it's my pleasure to welcome up our panelists. Thank you all so much. That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Margaret. Thank you. That was perfect. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
Good morning. All right, I think we've lost them ever so slightly. Good morning.
Good morning.
There we go. All right, I promised you no further ado, and this is it, no further ado. But it is first of all, my name is Eli Dvorkin. I'm the editorial and policy director at the Center for an Urban Future. Thank you for whoever is politely shushing in the back. I do see folks are maybe still at the very back of the room. We do have some seats scattered throughout, including if it says reserved for speakers, there are no more speakers, so feel free to fill those seats. Come on in, take some seats over here as well. It is my great pleasure to welcome our two panelists here today, and it's been such a thrill to work on this project with my team at the Center for Urban Future. So let me introduce them both very briefly. Sue Donahue, the Commissioner of the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, and Shekhar Krishnan, yes. I should have put in my notes, hold for applause. Especially in this room. And Shekhar Krishnan, of course, member of the New York City Council representing District 25, and of course the chair now for a second term of the Committee on Parks and Recreation. So welcome to both of you. It's so great to have you with us. You know, Commissioner, I wanted to start with you, in part because not only are you obviously leading the city's park system right now, but you've got such a wealth of experience on the ground helping to manage some of New York City's parks and seeing day in and day out what that experience is like. And under your leadership, we've seen certainly, in addition to major challenges, funding challenges, a global pandemic, and dealing with all the ways that New Yorkers are using their parks more than ever before, while also in many ways, not just use, but also climate change, seeing the stresses and the strains on our infrastructure. But we've also noticed the ways in which parks have stepped up maintenance and infrastructure investment, from bringing new concessions online to increasing tree inspections, and the latest Mayor's Management Report for folks that love the data will show you how those numbers have increased. But of course, there's always so much more work to do. So I'd love to start by asking you, Commissioner, what would New York City parks do with additional recurring dedicated revenues? And what would that mean for New Yorkers who are using their parks and I think care more about their parks than ever before?
Thank you, Eli, for the question. And really, I just want to start out by thanking the Center for an Urban Future for your focus on this topic and so many topics that are so important to the care and maintenance of our parks, and to everyone in the room for your advocacy and support of what we know is such an important topic and important for our agency, but also for New York City residents. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And so to your question, Eli, what would we do with more revenue? What a great question, and something that we think about a lot, and we know that we have very specific things that we could do and improve on if we had more revenue to do it. One of the things I'll point to, last year we launched what we call a second shift in our parks. We took new funding and deployed it to bringing staff to our parks on the weekends and in the evenings, Thursday through Sunday, late afternoon into the evening. First time we've ever done this in the park system. We think it makes so much sense. Bring the people and the staffing and the maintenance responsibilities when most people are using the park. So late afternoon, evenings, people are having their picnics, they're having their events, which we so love, have the staffing there to be able to support that. We did it in 100 what we call hotspot sites across the city. Those are sites that are seeing a lot of activity, barbecue areas, focus points for parties. We did it at 100 sites, 63 parks, really successful. We got great feedback from our electeds, from community members. With more funding, we'd expand that. We'd take that to more parks, more hotspot sites. We know that it works. We know it's important for the health and cleanliness of our parks. So that's one area we'd definitely look to expand. We also, last year, we launched a Climberpreneur apprenticeship program. We would look to expand apprenticeship programs for good green jobs in the city. The Climberpreneur apprenticeship program is a good example. For us, it's a hard to recruit title. People need very specific expertise, but it's incredibly important for us. And so we actually formulated a pilot program to give people an opportunity to be trained in this specialized skill, and then also be able to work with us in the department. We know we have these job openings. It's an opportunity for us to bring in people with this skill, expand our workforce, and help to enable good green jobs. We would love to do that beyond that for gardener apprenticeship programs, a thing we're looking at next. So being able to expand programming like this is really important. We also were fortunate. We got about $7 million from the administration at the end of 2022 And what we did with that was we expanded hours at 9 of our rec centers across the city. These are important centers for programming, for providing great opportunities for kids and families to play. Many of those programs are free. Our rec center members, it's free for 24 and under. So it was wonderful for us to be able to expand that. We'd take that further. We'd expand hours at all of our rec centers. So no shortage of good things that we could do with more funding.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. You know, Councilmember, I want to ask you, bring into the conversation, ask you something related to this. Obviously, you've been a fierce champion advocate for funding for the city's parks, and have fought to make sure that that city dollars in expense and maintenance budgets in particular do meet the needs. But our research has shown not this year, not just last year, but for decades, it's been difficult, if not impossible, to see the level of funding required year over year that would actually come close to meeting the full scope of those needs, the maintenance needs, the infrastructure needs as well, the staffing needs, as my colleague pointed out, where the Parks Department's working with a headcount that's 38% lower than it was in 1975. And we've seen these cuts recur over and over again whenever the city's strapped, in the 70s, in 2002, in 2010, and again, you know, just in the last 2 years. So I want to ask you a little bit about why new revenue could help change that equation. As you've spent so much time focusing on what ends up getting into the city budget, do you see real opportunities for options to generate new dedicated revenue, and why is that idea needed now?
It's a great question. Well, first, I want to say thank you so much, Eli, Jonathan, Center for Urban Future, for today's panel. It's so amazing to see such incredible parks advocates in this room, across the room. And I'm particularly fortunate to be on this panel with my partner and good friend, our Parks Commissioner, Sue Donahue, which people always, wonder how can we fight effectively for parks within the council, within city government. And I always say what makes my job really easy is to have such an incredible partner across the table. We can always work together to make sure we're advocating with all of our groups here for more resources for our park system. I think, Commissioner Donahue said it so effectively about what could be done with more dollars. A great question to be asked, and I think the answer really to the question of what can we do with new revenue is so much. I mean, the truth is, it is absolutely possible to generate new revenue for our parks and green spaces in New York City at this moment, and I would take it in a number of different levels. First, right now, we have to get out of the mindset of this scarcity notion that we are facing this crisis where resources and essential services need to be cut to support individuals, immigrants who are coming here, who also depend on those social services and resources. You do not cut your way to prosperity. You cannot implement austerity to make sure that our city thrives. And what this moment needs more than anything else is investments in the very kinds of essential programs and services that all New Yorkers depend on. And I would put parks right up there at the top. And so, part of it is changing that mindset. Changing the mindset of seeing parks as some sort of luxury or amenity that, in good times, we invest in some of them. In bad times, we cut from them right away. And you're looking at now parks, libraries, cultural institutions being cut, and that is absolutely unacceptable. So in this moment, there exist the resources. Not only do there exist the resources, but we must be creative in thinking about ways to generate new resources to invest in our parks. And I would identify 2 places. First, looking seriously at our city budget to find places to reallocate investments for our parks. If we want to be serious about budgeting, if we want to be serious about what it means in these times to budget effectively, then you look at places where there is truly extravagant and wasteful spending and reallocate those dollars to essential services like our parks and green spaces. That's one. And 2, we can look at creative ways to combine public and private investment to make sure we are creating new streams of investment. For example, swimming and water safety is a big focus of mine in our Parks Committee right now in our Parks Department. Water safety and water safety education and access to water is essential. But whether it's in the face of cuts to our Parks Opportunity Program for parks workers that we were able to restore through our work together, or cuts to other swim programs, one thing that Councilmember Julie Menon and I worked on was working with swim organizations and philanthropic funders to invest in free swimming for a pilot project for second graders across our city. Just one example of many that can exist of ways to bring private and public funding together. I see the Central Park Conservancy here, Betsy Smith is here too, and they've really done a great job working with us as well and thinking through ways in my own district in Jackson Heights, where we have some of the least amount of green space in all of New York City, to invest in public and open space there as well, like our 34th Avenue Open Street or Paseo Park. And so these are just some examples, there are many that exist, of ways that we can, in addition to getting our public priorities correct, looking at models of hybrid collaborative public and private partnerships to augment what our city government does to create new streams of funding and revenue for our parks in this moment.
Thank you, Councilmember. And, Commissioner, let me ask you a little bit about exactly that. I mean, you were, I think, really innovative at Prospect Park in leveraging new and growing existing public-private partnerships. And Morgan Monaco, your successor there, talked about how that work continues. So I want to ask you a little bit about what should we learn maybe on a citywide scale about what you yourself have implemented in terms of strengthening these kinds of public-private partnerships, which the council member also mentioned. Where are there opportunities to do more?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and such a good question. And I am very much a believer in and know the power of public-private partnerships. Was very fortunate to work in a very successful one in Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And so I certainly understand the importance of those partnerships, as does this administration. It's one that is very, very focused on public-private partnerships. We at the Parks Department have spent a lot of time focused on what we call our Adopt a Park program, which is a way for corporations, philanthropists, foundations to come in and support the work that we do. It provides an avenue in so that a Nike, an NBA, a number of different organizations can come in and adopt a park, adopt a playground. We've been very, very successful in our partnerships, $17 million invested over the last 5 years through our Adopt a Park program. And as I said, Nike has been an incredible partner of ours over a decade, 40 different amenities that they've come in and helped to refurbish, whether that be basketball courts, playgrounds, the Joe and Clara Sy Foundation in Brooklyn, great partner last year, refurbished some very under-resourced parks and basketball courts in Brooklyn. We want to provide opportunities, easy inroads for philanthropy, for corporations to help join us, help refurbish, help add to the assets that we can provide in the city, and make it easy for them to do so, provide great opportunities for them to do so, and at the same time improve our park system in areas where it's most needed. So our Adopt a Park program is one. And it also, we look to encourage corporate volunteers, come out, have team building days, volunteer with your local parks. Great way to get out and support our parks and green spaces. So that's been a really important way for public-private partnerships to invest in parks. The other thing that I'll point out, and it's gotten a lot of discussion this morning and in your report, is through our concessions. I'm incredibly proud of the work that our concession team does day in and day out to support our parks. I would argue that the reason why that they are being touted as an opportunity is because of that good work. I would offer one caveat. I ran a park and I ran concessions. They're not easy, right? If we think about fail rate for new restaurants in New York City, very high, right? It's incredibly difficult. Add to that a concession in a park, often seasonal. So not the be-all and end-all, and Eli, you and I talked about this as far as this report, but at the same time, Parks absolutely understands and has been very creative and innovative in the concessions that we're putting in our parks. 11 new concessions just within this administration, 10 more on the horizon. From everything from things like reopening the Loeb Boathouse in Central Park in 6 months, which people didn't think would be able to do, to the McCarran Park House in Brooklyn, to Corrado Cafe out in Staten Island. And we see, when we think about concessions, what's really important to understand is, yes, it's fee and revenue to the city, but it's also often a very significant capital investment. Right now in our park system, $183 million is committed to our parks and open space through our capital concession agreements. Phenomenal investment in our parks. And often what we're looking at is not just that fee or that investment, it's helping us to do things like The operator will take on adding a public restroom. I mentioned McCarran Park. It's a great example. We got a maintenance and operations facility out of it in a very busy, high-need park. So great facility, terrific coffee, I would recommend if you haven't tried it. Great new space for our park employees to be able to maintain a busy park. There were also, it's our first concession that's all electric. One of the things that our team has done is added as a ratings criteria sustainable design, something that we're looking to encourage. We want solar. We want what's going to add to the resiliency of the city and our public spaces. So that's also a criteria we're looking at. So yes, concessions, it's something we're really focused on. We've done an incredible job in this area. We're going to continue to do so. But we're looking at it beyond just fee revenue to the city. We're looking at what does that investment mean to our park system as a whole? What are we getting out of it? They are definitely, as Chris pointed out, they are complicated agreements. There's no doubt. Often we're looking for a big investment in our parks. But at the end of the day, we know it's improving the park system as a whole. Definitely something that we're continuing to work on, continuing to see as opportunity, but beyond just fee revenue for the city.
I should mention, I think the McCarran Park House was also built partially with lumber that was milled right there in Greenpoint.
Thank you
using
for
local,
mentioning that.
local
Exactly.
lumber.
It's a prime example
One
of
of
what
the
we're
ideas in our
looking to
report
do.
is about monetizing. People talked about mulch and other things, but we're really talking about the immense value of hardwood trees that fall in New York City every year.
Yes.
It's a big cost for the Parks Department, as you know, but we see that potential for that to be a source of revenue as well.
Absolutely.
So, Councilor, speaking of some of these specific ideas, let me ask you about some of them. I mean, I'd love to, we obviously spoke previously about just some of the 20 ideas in the report. I'd love to know which ones are resonating with you, and maybe most importantly, how do we start to move some of them forward?
Sure, that's a great question. I think there are a couple. First, in addition to what the commissioner mentioned too, I do think there are opportunities, within the concession agreements or concession process to find ways to also make sure that revenue that comes in, that is generated from operations on parkland, goes towards the Parks Department in particular, right? Not the city coffers in general, not to some sort of general fund, but to the Parks Department and even to the local parks in which those concessions or enterprises sit. And so I think that's a conversation we can continue to have and explore different ways to do that. But, on a smaller note, I just feel like there's ways to think about in this city, making sure that parks benefits directly from these streams of revenue. And I think in your report, you had identified that too as something as a key way to generate increased revenue, which is really not increasing revenue, but really allocating appropriately the revenue towards the Parks Department where it belongs, and towards the parks that would benefit from it locally. But thinking more broadly, a couple of things that stood out to me from the report, there was a proposal looking at private development in our city, and how do we make sure, again, thinking about private-public partnerships, but also private obligations to support public opportunities and public programs and spaces. There's no doubt that we have a housing crisis that is the most urgent crisis in this city. And I say it even before being a council member, as a fair housing lawyer for a number of years. This housing crisis is the most urgent one because it connects to everything else around us, right? Where you live affects everything, including the access to services and resources that our communities need. For example, I mentioned my district in Jackson Heights and Elmhurst. Where we live means we have access to the least amount of green space in New York City. And after redistricting this past January, we lost more parkland in my district. So I'm probably 51 out of 51 now, which only makes me even more eager and energetic as parks chair to keep fighting for parks, to flip that around and look at the script differently. But, it makes me think, as we tackle the housing crisis in our city and as development is happening across our city, well, why don't we also, and I think your proposal in the report really, CEO's proposal really hit that point too, look at ways for developers as part of their development to invest in park space, whether it's park maintenance, whether it's creating new park space, finding ways to create green space, making sure that developers that are developing privately also are required to look at investing in a public good like parks is really important. Now, our city code right now does things like pairs parking requirements with development. And honestly, in my district like Jackson Heights, we don't need more parking and parking requirements. We need more parks. And so I think we have to rethink some of those things that I think you all mentioned in the report of, well, if we have private development or other things, how can they be incentivized or required to invest in green space in and around the communities that they're building into? I think that is actually really important. And of course, broadening that out, looking at different ways where there are operations, venues, as you all mentioned too, cultural attractions in New York City that either operate on parkland or are close to parkland, where there is an opportunity for those entities to also contribute, as you all think identified in the report, to funds for parks, to invest in green space. I think these are kinds of things where we're changing as I read the report, changing the idea of being, in some cases, yes, voluntary, but also mandatory as well, to make sure that private-public partnership is working very effectively as it should be.
Thank you, Council Member. And Commissioner, I want to ask you a similar question and just get your sense. Are there one or two of the ideas that really stand out to you, and what kind of partnership, support from other folks in government, from philanthropy or the private sector would you need to move some of them forward?
Thank you. Yes. The stadium surcharge is one that we at Parks have talked about for a long time. We absolutely see the benefit of that. As noted earlier, many of these stadiums, Yankees, Mets, Brooklyn Cyclones, sit on parkland. And so we think it absolutely makes sense to explore a surcharge on tickets. We would put that towards a fund to caring for our athletic fields, maintenance for our athletic fields, which are in such high demand always and always in need of maintenance. So we think that's an important one to pursue. We do believe that it involves state legislature, so it's something we would need a lot of support from people in this room and our elected officials to pursue. You mentioned earlier, Eli, about monetizing organic waste. That's something that we are very much interested in as well, and I want to tout the good work of Jennifer Greenfeld, our Deputy Commissioner for Environment and Planning. We have a pilot right now working with an organization called Trilocks in Brooklyn that works with a Brooklyn Workforce Development Center that does training for local woodworkers to help the next generation of local craftspeople. And with a pilot with Trilocks, what we're looking to do is interrupt what has historically been a cycle of, our trees are removed, they fall down, and we either chip them, we use them for mulch, but that is about the end of their use. With this pilot, what we're looking to do is really think about how can we reuse that timber? How can it be an asset instead of adding to the waste stream, adding to our carbon footprint in terms of disposal? How can we look at that timber in terms of possibilities for decking, furniture, benches in our parks, tree guards, a whole host of different ways that we could use that timber, we know. And so we're excited about this pilot. We want to see the opportunities that it provides so that we're keeping the benefits of our urban forests in New York City, also keeping the carbon that's so important, reducing our environmental footprint. So we are all for ideas like that and, in fact, are actively pursuing them. You heard the deputy mayor speak earlier. She has been laser focused on the federal and state grant money. She is holding weekly or bi-weekly meetings with all of us sister agencies to really investigate, okay, what grants are we applying for? Who's going to do it? What's our best, potential here? And we've been successful. It was mentioned earlier, we received a $15 million grant at the Parks Department focused on green jobs and our urban tree canopy that we're really excited about moving forward. That is that $15 million, it's almost $1 billion that this administration has been able to garner through federal grant money. So no doubt, really important source of funding that we are very actively pursuing. The deputy mayor also mentioned the RAISE grant, the USDOT RAISE grant that we received for expanding greenways. So we're using that money to create a vision plan. How do we connect those under-resourced communities that have not had access to greenways? How do we look at a vision for really connecting our greenways, providing more access to our green spaces? We're going to be able to do that through this RAISE grant. So no doubt that that's something we feel. We appreciate it being raised in this report. We need everybody in this room to be talking to their state and local legislators, reaching out, saying this money needs to come to New York. We have a lot of unmet needs, a lot of under-resourced communities. We absolutely feel that state and federal money coming to New York is really important.
That's great, Commissioner. Thank you. I think we have just a few minutes. We could take 1 or 2 questions from the audience. I bet there's more than that, but if you just lift your hands up so I can see. As before, a microphone will come around. Let me know who you are, who you're with, and please do try to keep your questions brief, and we'll go straight to the middle here. And the microphone's coming your way. Just 1 second. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Hi, thank you. Really, thank you for this report. Thank you for the panel before and this panel. I'm a huge believer in the commons, which I believe Parks Department represents. One of the questions I have has to do with privatization of parkland. And I do have some concerns about that. And Bill Moyers wrote a great thing about Yankee Stadium. But how do we think about that? How do we think about parks, you've all addressed this, but parks that can't attract funding? I'm from Sarah Roosevelt Park. So the place we're left in is can attract big funding, don't want to privatize, don't want to create another layer between the public and parks, but no money. So I guess this has all been addressed to that, but we're also seeing the money that when it does come in gentrifies a neighborhood. And I'm glad you mentioned housing because we're seeing a lot of displacement already. Simple.
Thank you for your question. The issue of privatization is one we think a lot about. That's why we're very careful with things like sponsorship, naming things, putting logos on things. And we're also, very focused on public-private partnerships and the public aspect of that. As was mentioned earlier, as Adam, I think, raised, we're incredibly fortunate at the Parks Department. We have a long history of support from the public in our parks. And think about whether it's the biggest conservancy to the smallest grassroots organization, those are individuals volunteering, stepping up to volunteer, to donate, to contribute to their parks. And the impact has been transformational. You look at the Bronx River Alliance, what has happened to the Bronx River because of 40 years of people caring about that part. So we know the value of that kind of grassroots support. We're looking to support it in every way we can. Last year, we launched something called Let's Green NYC. It was all about counting, celebrating our volunteers, providing an online resource, and I want to mention this, the woman from the East River Esplanade who brought this up. We specifically put on our website and have the ability for organizations to post where they are. There's a map that shows so that organizations can show that they're out there, talk about the events they have, build support for their events. We know that strong organizations around parks all across the city mean a stronger park system. Our partnerships for parks, our partnership with the City Parks Foundation and the work they have done supporting grassroots organizations, everything from tools to helping with volunteer events, really helps to enliven our park system. So we're very focused on supporting that whole network of partners. And we do that at the grassroots level through our partnerships for parks all the way up to the biggest conservancies. So very much hear you. We're very focused on, the issue of privatization, wanting it to be that it is really the public engaging always with their park system. Free, accessible, open, equitable. That's always been our focus and will continue to be.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. I'll come right here to the front row. Oh, the microphone's coming. Just a sec. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. So my name is Rosa Chang with Gotham Park, a newly opened park right under the Brooklyn Bridge, but in the Manhattan side, so not famous yet, and very underlooked or overlooked. My question actually, well, I had one question, one comment. Question is, how do we make sure that all of these amazing ideas that, I'm also a relentless optimist, so I really hope that it's going to generate significant revenues for parks. How do we make sure it actually increases the bottom line for parks and doesn't allow the city to have a reason to maybe step back in their responsibility for funding these public spaces, because we desperately need the funding to increase on the part of city, as well as try to make all of these amazing ideas actually happen. Secondly, how do we strengthen our outreach to the biggest users of these public spaces? So, like, I'm thinking families, for instance, youth, they can't vote, they're very young. Families are one of the biggest users of all of our public spaces because we need them, frankly, for sanity space and for air. How do we get these very, very busy families engaged in this discussion, because they are fighting for spaces, or they would be advocating for spaces that have a direct impact on their daily lives, their weekend lives, their afternoon lives?
Well, I think those are really, really important questions. And you know, the first question, Rosa, you raised is that's the most urgent challenge of our time when it comes to parks advocacy and parks work, is that we have to make sure that public investment, public spending is the foundation upon which all of this is built, right? It's not, none of what we talk about, none of, you know, the conversations about private-public partnerships or anything can be in replacement or in lieu of public dollars and spending. And so that's also a mindset shift that we have to make sure that everyone in city government and City Hall and the mayor himself understands too, is that this requires us to invest substantially public dollars in our parks. And frankly, it goes back decades, I think, Eli, as you mentioned. The charts, even as I see preparing for parks hearings from our excellent committee staff and the council, of the way in which public dollars have declined over time, over decades, you know, is incredible. And it's really, and I put the blame squarely at the feet of city government, where, you know, with the advent of conservancies, and I think Adam mentioned it too from New Yorkers for Parks, that provided an ability to free up public resources to spend on parks that don't have the ability to have conservancies. Instead, city government used that as an excuse to shrink back over time, and that's why we're in the problem we are today. And I know it's surmountable, clearly, because if you look at other cities across the country and how much other cities that are smaller than us invest per capita in their parks, their budget that's dedicated, even percentage-wise, to parks, you know, ours pales in comparison. So this was a choice that we made, a choice we did not have to make, and it was a very bad choice on our part to discard parks and put them to the side. And so we, I think, need to really, as advocates, as elected, as partners in government, everyone come together to change that narrative, to change that discourse around parks, and demand exactly the kind of investment that we need, just as a starting point. 1% for parks, or $1 billion in our city's budget, is not the end of the conversation. That's just doing right by our parks and you know, undoing decades of disinvestment. So, you know, it's not anything novel or radical in that sense, right? And so I think putting that front and center, making that push, and showing how those dollars could help in one of the most difficult aspects of parks work: maintenance, taking care of our parks, funding our parks workers. That's how we make that push. And I think that ties to your second question of, you know, it's how do we engage and make sure people who most depend on parks, seniors, families, children. I know very well the importance of sanity with our parks, and as a parent of 2 young children, how important our parks are, and getting our kids out of the house and getting them to burn off their energy in the parks. And there are so many who feel the exact same way, who need these parks and depend on them. I give the example of, you know, I mentioned it before, 34th Avenue Open Street, Paseo Park, which is a 30-block open street that we're working to transform into a linear park in Jackson Heights because we don't have park space. Started during the pandemic, opening a street just a few blocks. It's now evolved into a 30-block space with 6 car-free pedestrian plazas. One in front of each of the 6 public schools in our block, so that children can walk freely to school in the morning, mine included, and for pickup in the afternoon. And so, you know, what we've seen in that work is how when we have events there, when we create the space for people to come, parents, seniors, families, people just going for a walk, congregate there, and also it makes them attached to that space and makes them want to fight for it and make sure that we get the proper resources to support it too. So it's almost like as we create the parks, Got the Park is a good example. I was so happy when I came to visit it too, and it brings people in. They themselves see how important these spaces are, and that's how we engage them in a very grassroots way into thinking about how can I volunteer in the park through one of our, you know, volunteer programs, or be a steward for one of our parks, or how can I join, the work that we're doing in the Playfair Coalition, or the programming that City Parks Foundation puts on as well. How can I be a part of that? And then from there, we build up into larger policy and advocacy to make sure we get the investments that we need to. And I really think it starts in simply creating the public space, right? That's the point of public space, and that's why it's so important.
And Eli, if I could, I just want to add to that, and so well said, council member. And, I would just say, part of, how do we raise awareness is that's what we're doing here today, that, with elected officials like Shaker and so many, Shakers everywhere talking about parks, and we so appreciate that. But so many elected officials, the Center for an Urban Future, forums like this. As I mentioned, we launched this Let's Green initiative last year, and we actually started counting how many people are actively engaged and volunteer in our parks. We can't do advocacy, we can't reach out until we know how many people we're talking to, and we want to illuminate that good work that people do. We know we're so grateful to have it. We had almost 400,000 people engaging in our parks last year. That's a phenomenal number, and we want to further that. We want to highlight that good work. We want to bring people in. And you're right. Kids and families, people have such a stake in their parks, and we know that there's a huge audience out there. We're looking to find new and innovative ways that we can attract them. I think your work with Gotham Park is such a good example of what advocacy can do. It was people coming together and banding around this good idea, and it happened. It got the attention of City Hall. It's now happening. We're adding new skate parks across the city. Good ideas with a lot of people behind them, thanks to Playfair and other entities like that. It's bringing voices together in a really important way. So it's all good work.
Thank you.
All right. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but another round of applause for this amazing panel. I want to say a couple of really quick things in conclusion. First of all, it's so clear from this panel and from the previous panel that we have the leadership in this city, the passion, the supporters for our parks. We need more revenue. We need more dollars for our parks, and so we're hoping that our report can be one contributing factor to try to move it along. We've got great advocates in the room, so I hope you'll join with us and try to keep this going. We're going to try to keep it going. If you have ideas for us on how to do it, please reach out and let us know. If there's ideas in our report that you think are good, please reach out and let us know. If you have other ideas, we'd love to hear them too. If you haven't already read it, please definitely check out our report. There's a QR code on the agenda today that takes you right to the report. Also, in addition to our two amazing government leaders that are here, I want to really make sure to thank again Eli and John. Not only for their excellent job moderating our panels today, but really for all the great work they did researching and writing this report. And I also want to mention, we have a big team at the Center for an Urban Future, staff and interns that do such important work that contributed to this report. We actually had a couple of really fantastic interns, last cohort of our interns, that did so much great research about some of the things happening in other parts of the country with parks that really contributed to this work. So a big shout out to them. And lastly, how cool is it we're in the green space for this conversation? Anyway, thanks for being here.